policy work, a whole bunch of those things. And so I am here to be able to talk about that. I worked with survivors in direct service for a lot of years before coming into this role, but I don't do so presently. I do more of this community education stuff now. So I'm really glad that Sarah's here because she does a lot of direct service work with survivors currently and can speak to that as well. Sarah, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. So yes, my name is Sarah Cook and I use she, her, hers pronouns. And I am currently completing my Master of Social Work at Portland State University. I'll be done with that in June. So for that, I'm in the practice and leadership with communities and organizations focus, which is how I was partnered up with Shannon and the DSVCO for my internship. But as Shannon mentioned, my background is pretty much majority in direct service, and I still hold a couple of different roles in the Multnomah County continuum with various nonprofits providing direct service. So I'm working with survivors every week, in addition to doing some more of the background work as well throughout my internship. So I kind of have a little bit of a strange, unique perspective of switching back and forth between those various hats throughout the course of each week. So for that, I will touch on some of my experience as well, throughout this presentation on some of the things that I commonly see coming up still with survivors. But starting out, we'll kind of what to expect from today's session. For this, as Brett mentioned, people are welcome to put comments or questions in the chat. We'll be looking at that throughout this time together. And we'll also have a couple of breaks or opportunities for you to unmute yourself to ask questions or add comments. Please feel free to engage and interact with us to whatever your comfort level is. This is designed to be supportive to you. So questions or anything that you have, we're here to help answer. So we'll start out today by kind of grounding ourselves in a common understanding of domestic violence, a definition of what that means and some of the related terms and concepts that are often used interchangeably with that. And then we'll go into dismantling some of the common myths that come up about domestic violence, some of those narratives and stories that we've all heard that aren't necessarily an accurate reflection of DV. And then we'll go over some strategies for safety planning, especially around things that may come up in your work, in particular with survivors, and diving briefly as well into best practices when working with trauma survivors, things to think about in your work and also about generally what experiences may be for them and for taking care of yourselves as well. And then we'll round it out by going over some of the local resources to Oregon, as well as some of the national resources that are available for domestic sexual violence providers. So to start us out, we'd first like to get a little bit of feedback from you. Again, you can either unmute yourselves or if you'd like to put something in the chat about what do you know about domestic violence or what have you heard? So.
Whoever decides to be vulnerable and share something first will get a virtual cookie. Allison wins it. So Sarah, I'm going to read the things that are popping up in the chat. Allison says, I worked indirectly with DV victims and directly with victims of abusive sexual relationships. And Tiffany shares lived it, represented survivors, trained judges. Shelby says, I have represented survivors in restraining order hearings and family law cases. Taylor, I have supported and represented DV survivors in restraining order and family law cases. I want to thank folks for sharing in the chat and for also acknowledging when you worked with survivors as well as if you've experienced violence. We know that folks who are in the room are going to have personal, interactions with this stuff in their lives. It doesn't just affect us in the professional setting. So thank you for that. That's all I've got in the chat so far, Sarah. I take it back. Here's some more. GP Vor, it can happen to anyone. I have represented survivors and advised respondents served with FAPA orders. And Sue says represented survivors in immigration proceedings, filed VAWA and U visa petitions.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for sharing that. And as Shannon mentioned, we kind of know a lot of this information will bring out certain reactions. I too am a survivor in addition to doing this work. And so I always please, recommend take care of yourselves in whatever way you need to throughout this. Let us know how we can support you or do whatever you need to do to take care of yourselves. It's the same thing that we talk about with survivors and all community partners. So for this, Shannon, if you want to jump on over to our next slide around for this kind of conversation and presentation today, kind of the definition or overarching theme of domestic violence that we use is that domestic violence is a pattern of coercive, controlling, or abusive behavior that is used by one person to gain or maintain power and control over another person. So as we know, that can take many different forms. That's actually something that Shannon will be talking about soon here, about some of the different types of domestic violence and ways that that surfaces. But we also know that there are a lot of related terms and concepts that tend to come up in these conversations. So you may hear some of these other terms used interchangeably or in relation to domestic violence. So oftentimes, if you hear something similar, or one of these other words, like intimate partner violence or IPV, battering, coercive control or intimate terrorism, dating violence, elder abuse or abuse later in life, sexual assault or rape, or child abuse, both experienced directly or indirectly through exposure to violence. Those are all things that kind of come under this umbrella of domestic violence that comes back to that power and control aspect that we see. And so this will be a piece here where Shannon will give a little bit more information about, domestic violence, what we see, and those types that I talked about.
Thanks so much. And thanks folks for bearing with us as we, mute and unmute and go back and forth. So we know that that can be a little bit awkward, but welcome to the virtual world, right? So as Sarah said, I want to talk a little bit about some data, and then we're going to talk about types and tactics. I'm losing my voice a little bit. I talked a lot this morning at another training, so I apologize if I'm a little scratchy. When we look at data and when we talk about how often domestic violence occurs, you tend to see these statistics at the top a lot. So 1 in 3 women and 1 in 7 men will experience physical abuse from an intimate partner. Now, as Sarah mentioned, and as we're going to look at more in depth on the next slide, there's a lot more involved in domestic violence than just physical abuse, right? So whenever we add in all those other forms, these numbers would undoubtedly increase from what we see here. But just sort of using this as a touchstone, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 7 men, I'd like to point out a couple of things that I think are important as we move forward through the rest of the workshop this morning. The first is that data can be a little bit skewed or misunderstood depending on how it's reported, who it's gathered from, what the methods are, all of that. Excuse me. And so one of the things I want to point out is the role of gender identity and sexual orientation in data. I always like to highlight that because whenever we see the statistics of 1 in 3 women and 1 in 7 men, this is sort of a catch-all number. This is looking at just the general population. And what we know is that just like so many things in our world, things are compounded. Domestic violence is compounded by other oppressions. right? And other instances of identity, other instances of privilege. So sexism, heterosexism, transphobia, racism, ableism, all of these things affect these numbers. And what we know for folks who are in relationships with people of the same gender is that these numbers shift. So when we look at men, for instance, who are in relationships with other men, their risk isn't 1 in 7 anymore. It's actually about 1 in 3, 1 in 4. And so that shifts if you're working with individuals who are in relationships with same gender partners. And I think that's important to note, because when we talk about male survivors, a lot of times people default thinking to heterosexual male survivors. And when we talk about folks in same gender relationships or in relationships with non-binary identifying folks, there's a whole nother world of challenges and potential barriers to talking about domestic violence, to getting culturally appropriate resources for them. All of that comes into play. And we'll look at that a little bit when we talk about resources, because we do have some really great places and programs in Multnomah County and in nearby counties that offer specialized services to folks who are part of the LGBTQ+ community, or who have other culturally relevant factors that they want to be present in the services and supports they receive. So that is really important. It also is helpful to think about this term of primary aggressor and secondary aggressor. I don't know if folks have heard this before. It gets used a lot with law enforcement and sometimes in child welfare cases. And the way that it usually comes up is people will say, well, both partners use some sort of violence, use some sort of aggressive act. And so doesn't that mean that there's mutual abuse? And what we know, if you look back to that definition of domestic violence that Sarah reviewed, is that it's about one person gaining or maintaining control over another person. This, by the way, is Percy, my cat. Sarah knows him well. You all will probably get to know him well over the next 2 hours. So what we know about that is that sometimes people who are victims of domestic violence start to use aggressive behaviors back towards a perpetrator, right? They may do this because they're using it in self-defense. They may do this as a harm reduction strategy. I have worked over the years with a lot of mothers, for instance, who say, I would instigate the abuse to make it worsen and escalate before my kids got home from school. So they're doing it as a way to try to minimize the harm and exposure to their kids. They know the abuse is going to happen. It's inevitable. The perpetrator does it all the time, but they're trying to regain a little bit of safety and control over how bad the impact of that is. And what happens is sometimes those folks get labeled abusers or get arrested. And what we actually, the term we actually use is secondary aggressor in law enforcement. And what that means is that it's very different from domestic violence. If the primary abuse were to stop, their behaviors would stop. They wouldn't be using aggressive behaviors without that abuse as an instigator. And that's really important when we talk about data. And I think when we talk about cases that do reach family court or criminal courts, is to be able to sort of sort out if somebody who's actually a victim has been labeled as an aggressive or a perpetrator, and what that shows up like in the data and the way they're viewed by other people. So that's kind of a big, long explanation, but something that I think is very important to the work that you all will do with survivors and the types of things you may hear when you're hearing about cases, hearing about relationships, trying to figure out what the dynamics are. Are there any questions about that in particular before we move on? Okay, so this other data here on this slide, the thing I really want to point out, this particular statistic of over 3 women a day are murdered by a current or former intimate partner. I put this here because I think it's really important when we're talking about the escalation of violence and the severity of someone's life being at risk, that there are gender differences. Women are much more at risk than men of being murdered by partners. Trans women are much, much more at risk of being murdered by partners than cisgender women. And then when we look at these other disparities, factors of ability, factors of race, those also play into it too. Because they're systemic inequities, a lot of times what we see is that rates of homicide for Black women, for Indigenous women, for disabled women are much higher than maybe an able-bodied white woman. And this isn't because violence is more present in those communities. It's because of systemic and institutional racism and systemic and institutional barriers that make it much more difficult for some members of our communities to access safety, to access resources, to be believed, to be found credible. So when we talk about domestic violence and when we talk about resources, it's really important to think about what some of those challenges may be and how to help navigate that and how to help the survivor navigate that. And we'll look at that when we talk about how to work with advocates and how to make appropriate referrals later in the training. So this here, many of you, if we were in a room in person, I would ask y'all to raise your hands if you've seen the power and control wheel, and I bet that a lot of hands would go up. This is sort of a classic domestic violence tool. It's created out of Duluth, Minnesota, many, many years ago from support groups and process groups with survivors and with advocates. And what this does is lay out, you'll see the circle on the outside, physical and sexual violence. Those are the obvious sort of physical manifestations. But in that pattern of domestic violence, there's lots of other things going on inside that are often much more difficult to spot, a little bit more difficult to identify, and that support the continued use of physical violence or sexual violence by the abuser. So you see these sort of 7 types of violence listed on the side of your screen: physical abuse, sexual abuse, financial or economic, verbal, emotional, psychological, technological, spiritual, and stalking. These are the types of violence that might come into play to make up that larger pattern of abuse for a survivor. And so just because one isn't present doesn't mean 5 others aren't, right? Somebody who isn't experiencing physical violence may still be experiencing tons of other abuse and control in their relationship that's impacting them. And I think we'd like to take a few minutes, if we can, to sort of break down these, just to give a few examples so folks can clearly think about how they may show up. And so I'm going to ask folks to put in the chat, let's just go through them one by one. What are some examples of physical abuse that the survivors you work with might experience? You can pop stuff in the chat.
From Allison, we have strangulation, slapping, kicking, shoving, pushing downstairs, and scratching. Taylor says hitting, pushing, or choking. Eileen says a client whose domestic partner hits her in the head when he thinks that she's being, in quotes, stupid. And Bernadette says throwing things at or on.
Thank you. Those are really great examples, all things that I know Sarah and I have heard and seen many times before. I'm just going to highlight too that there are some physical abuse tactics that are a little more subtle. Things like messing with someone's sleep, sleep deprivation, waking them up constantly throughout the night. Things like coercing someone into using drugs or alcohol that they don't want to. And so I just want to add those into the physical abuse category too, because they definitely have physical impacts. And sometimes they're things that are more difficult to like call 911 and say, my partner's woken me up 5 times last night, right? That's not necessarily something that physical abuse, it's going to qualify as physical abuse under sort of the law, but we know definitely is part of that pattern. So great examples, thank you. Let's move on to sexual abuse. Can folks pop a couple in the chat there?
And one thing too, I'll add in while people are typing, physical intimidation as well is something that comes up very, very frequently for me. I have multiple conversations every week around people saying they won't let me leave my bedroom. You know, they'll block the door. They won't let me move around the kitchen freely. Things like that that may not rise to that level of like hitting or anything like that, but still is controlling what someone physically is able to do with their own body comes up a lot. So. And on the sexual abuse side, we have from Allison, forced oral sex, either giving or receiving, rape, touching or fondling over or under clothes, and forced kissing. Eileen has a mother whose former partner requires a blowjob before letting her see her non-custodial children. Absolutely.
Yes, those are really apt examples. Basically, when we're talking about sexual abuse, right? And feel free to keep putting stuff in the chat as we're sort of explaining too. As we're talking about sexual abuse, we're talking about anything that the other partner does not feel they have the free choice and consent, option in. Anything that they feel coerced or forced or pressured or threatened or unsafe would qualify here. And one of the things that I don't see in the chat yet that I also want to call out is something we often refer to as reproductive coercion, which is a pretty common sexual abuse tactic in domestic violence. And that's really when one person is trying to take away the other person's free will and choice over their ability to reproduce, right? It's you must have this baby or you must not have this baby. And if you don't do what I want you to do, there's going to be harm. There's going to be, a problem. And so wherever somebody feels that they have to or can't do whatever they want to, whether that's birth control, abortion, any of those choices for somebody. Anything else? Okay, I don't see anything else coming up in the chat, so I'm going to keep us moving through some of these. Financial and economic abuse. What do we see there? People are thinking, hopefully, thinking really hard.
All right, we have from GP Vort, depriving allowance or grocery money to coerce desired goal of control. Allison has conditioning visa status on sex, coercive control, taking full control over everything, no credit cards allowed, etc. Shelby has not allowing the partner to work. Eileen put in the chat, one partner telling the other he doesn't have a valid driver's license or insurance, so she won't compel him to bring the kids to her for a visit. And Tiffany has controlling money, bank account, credit cards, giving an allowance for food, demanding receipts. And one that I will add that is coming up a lot right now around the eviction moratorium in particular is around controlling rent money, that even if a survivor is working and has income, around the partner not allowing them to pay the rent, so that the rent money starts to stack up on what they'll owe at the end of the moratorium. So that's kind of a new take on some of the rent control that we see a lot.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone in the chat. Thank you, Sarah, for that. One that I'll add is withholding or destroying somebody's key identification cards. So immigration paperwork, driver's licenses, visa documents, things like that. I think we see quite a bit so that they can't access benefits or employment. There's nothing more frustrating sometimes to handle than not having any sort of formal identification and then trying to obtain some, because you kind of have to have one in order to get another. Like you have to have a social security card in order to get driver's license or vice versa. There's all of these requirements. So if your partner has taken those from you, you can really feel pretty stuck about where do I turn, where do I go for economic assistance. One of the things about financial and economic abuse too that I just like to put in people's minds is that when we're talking about stuff like physical violence, sexual violence, those are pretty blatant when they're happening, right? Like, you know, if someone's hitting you, you're experiencing that in the moment. A lot of times with financial and economic abuse, you may not even know the extent of some of the things that the other person has done until you're trying to leave or after you've left, because you may not know they opened credit cards in your name and ruined your credit, or you may not know that they weren't paying the bills they said they were going to pay that were in your name. And a lot of times that stuff can really have a long lasting sort of re-traumatizing effect for people as they sort of learn the depth of that. When we move on to emotional, psychological abuse, or even verbal abuse, let's kind of jump into those together here. So there are, I'm going to talk for a minute, and I'm going to encourage y'all to put stuff in the chat while I talk for a minute. So there are some of the obvious, I think, things that come to mind, right? Shaming, victim blaming, this is your fault. Some of the things that have come to be more, what's the word I want to use? I guess just more known about in our culture and community over the last couple of years are tactics around gaslighting. That's a term that I think was pretty unique to the DV field for a long time. And lately people have started to learn about it. And it's made me very happy that people have started to learn about it. Would anyone on the call or in the room like to try to take a try at defining what gaslighting is, or giving an example of gaslighting for the rest of us? And you can unmute and speak, you don't have to type it. No one wants to? Sarah, do you want to?
I suppose I could. So yeah, gaslighting is what often people refer to as kind of the crazy making, as Ezra just put in, where you tell someone they're going crazy. So it actually stems from a film around someone turning on the gas on the stove, and you know, there's the smell of gas when that happens, and being told, no, you're making that up, it's in your head. So it's that kind of way of taking situations and twisting it back on the survivor so that they think that it's all in their head. These things are not actually happening. It's them interpreting it wrong.
Yeah, and one of the things that I like to really point out about gaslighting is it's extremely important for anybody who's trying to support survivors, whether you're in an advocacy role, a legal role, any other social services or social worker role, to understand that gaslighting is incredibly common in domestic violence relationships, and to trust it whenever a survivor is telling you about it. Because there is an easy bias to jump in and to say, oh, they sound pretty paranoid, right? Maybe this is impacts of their mental health, or maybe this is impacts of substances they're taking. And that is a natural human bias. I'm not saying anybody's doing that on purpose, but it's important for us to be able to step back and say, this may sound pretty wild, but I also know that some pretty wild things happen in domestic violence. And so I'm going to trust and ask more questions and dig into this rather than just writing it off. That is a really important thing for a lot of survivors that I've worked with, is they have felt sort of dismissed when sharing some of those experiences with people in the past.
And I'll add on to that what Jim put in the chat there about controlling or steering a conversation with BS themes. One of the big things that comes up that abusers will do is reflect back what the survivor said, but just change a couple of the key words around so that they're manipulating that message back. So it's kind of one of those things to be cautious of as well when you're working with survivors and reflecting things back that they say, of being sure to make sure you are understanding what they meant and not accidentally twisting it a little bit when that's something that often happens a lot to them in a negative way.
Absolutely. Let's chat quickly about technological abuse. This one, you know, changing all the time. It's constantly evolving. but definitely something that can tie into gaslighting and can tie in to emotional abuse as well as some of these other kinds of abuse. I'm curious if folks would share any things that you've seen around tech abuse or ways that that has shown up for clients you've worked with. So
from Taylor, we have tracking someone's phone. From Shelby, again, tracking someone's phone or changing passwords to online accounts. From Allison, threat of posting pornographic images, perhaps. Absolutely, there's a lot of tie-in with the sexual abuse on this. And from Tiffany, using social media, pretending to be a survivor.
Absolutely. And the only thing that I'll really say before we move on is that this is easier and easier to do all the time. And so I think I still run into cases where I talk to some folks and there's maybe an assumption that you have to be really technologically savvy to institute some of these things. And the reality is you just don't anymore. A lot of it is so easy and there's really easy instructions about it. And so please don't assume that the ability to use these tools is based on someone's like formal educational level or age group. Sometimes we, have a bias against older folks and their ability to use technology. It really can span the gamut. Okay, and that leads us in. I'm going to move these last two in order for a minute, just because stalking comes so naturally off of technological abuse. That stalking can, of course, be driven by technology via phone, via computer, all of that. It can also be sort of old school, just following someone around, right? Showing up at their workplace, showing up at their kids' school, all of that. We know that about 2/3 of stalking cases that make it to the courts are usually domestic violence or intimate partner violence related. So while we might see in sort of news reports or media, movies, these examples of like the stranger who becomes sort of obsessed and stalks someone, the reality is most of the time there's a domestic violence crossover and correlation in those cases. Is there anything you want to say, Sarah, about stalking before I move on? Just don't want to rush through it.
Yeah, I think one of the ones that from the chat, Shelby had installing spyware on computers and phones, things like that, especially around those comments around tracking someone. And also within the community, oftentimes we find that in communities of color or smaller communities where people know each other, some of that stalking behavior comes through contact with friends. I'm going to constantly be harassing your friends as a way to find out where you are, things like that.
Thank you. Yeah, that reminds me to clarify and to point out too that just because a relationship ends or the perpetrator is potentially even incarcerated doesn't mean that the domestic violence and the stalking stops. Because a lot of times they may, as Sarah said, get friends involved, family involved, other people they know involved. And I think that's important sometimes for people to hear, because if you haven't done a lot of work with domestic violence yet, I think there's a message out there in the world, and we'll get to myths and facts, but I think there's a message often that like, oh, if the perpetrator gets incarcerated, if they're put in jail, everything's fine, right? Everything's going to be okay. The person's safe. And the reality is that's not always the case. And so just thinking about those other ways that stalking can play out and continue. Thank you, Sarah, for reminding me of that. And the last one I just want to highlight here, spiritual or moral abuse. This one isn't talked about as much, so this might not be on your radar as sort of a tactic or type. But what this really means is harming someone at the core of their belief systems, of who they are and how they walk through the world. So that can be based in religion, but it doesn't have to be based in religion, right? It could be based in your personal ethics and morals, whether that has anything to do with religion or not. And we see this a lot with individuals who are using violence, who may take line of scripture, for instance, out of context and use it to justify control and abuse over their partner. Or they may try to isolate somebody from their religious or spiritual community and sort of use those social contacts as a tool to keep somebody under their control. So there's a few different ways that that shows up. Anybody have any other examples that you'd like to share? Those are just a couple.
We have an example from Tiffany in the chat around the church convincing the client that she was the reason for the violence and was possessed by the devil and did an exorcism. So yeah, again, going back to sometimes using religious grounds to justify violence.
Wow. I just want to say that's a very intense example as well. I appreciate you sharing it. A really intense example of how just the multiple layers of trauma that can occur here, the original trauma from the abuser and then the church and everything that then happened for that person. So we list all these out because, you know, we could talk about this all day. Like we could talk for 8 hours about examples and things that we've seen. But we just want to make sure folks have some examples of each of these in their mind so that when we're talking about resources and supports, you can sort of think about, okay, if someone's primary challenge, if somebody's primary abuse is coming through the form of financial abuse and control, let's think about what types of resources and supports they might need the most and how to help guide that sort of resource plan, that safety plan that you might start to work on with somebody. Also, this power and control wheel picture that's on your slide, I just want to highlight that you can easily Google domestic violence power and control wheel, and it's available in different languages, and there are specialized ones for different cultural communities. So I know that there's one, for instance, for immigrants and refugees, and it takes a look at some of the ways that that immigration status is sometimes leveraged by abusers. So feel free to, Google away for whatever feels most relevant to the folks you're serving. There's a lot of great resources out there around that. All right, so some common myths and facts, and I'm going to sort of lead this slide to Sarah. I'm going to invite you in, of course, as we go through these to talk about them. Some of these are really big topics. We're going to go over them pretty quickly since we just have 2 hours today. But these are probably some of the most common pervasive myths that are out there, certainly not all encompassing. There's other stuff out there we could talk about too. But one of the first things that comes up is this issue, of course, of domestic violence being about anger, right? I get asked sometimes to do like media response when there's local domestic violence cases. And one of the most frequent things that always comes up is this narrative that somebody just snapped, somebody just lost control, they couldn't manage their feelings anymore, and they just exploded, right? And we know really clearly from a lot of research, I'm happy to send research citations to folks if you need them for anything you're working on, that this is not about anger. Now you can have an abusive person who has an anger management issue and a domestic violence issue, right? You can have, co-occurring things. But when we talk to survivors and when we talk to people using violence and perpetrating violence, it becomes really clear that the choices are being made along the way by an abusive person towards a specific person, right? This isn't anger that's blowing up anywhere in the middle of the street, usually at their boss, at their parents. It's very thoughtful choices. When you talk to a survivor and they're talking about their partner throwing stuff around the room, and if you stop and ask them, whose stuff did they throw? Usually there's a very specific choice made, right? Where they're not picking up their own smartphone and smashing it into the wall, they're picking up their partner's. And so there is an ability to make decisions there that happens. That goes back to sort of fundamental belief systems and decision making. And so anger management, not usually a helpful thing when we're talking about supporting people using violence. There are different programs for that, abuse intervention programs that really get to some of the underlying belief systems there. Sarah, anything you have on that to add?
No, I think that it goes back to that definition. Domestic violence is a pattern of control. It's not a one-off out of the blue. There was nothing in the world at all that could have anticipated this happening. There's a pattern of things that lead up to sometimes some of those things that may seem like a snap.
Excellent. This next one, I'm going to go over really quickly, but I always like to mention it, particularly when we're talking to attorneys where judges might be trying to make decisions about what needs to happen and where you may be able to advocate for your clients here. Couples counseling is a myth as far as it being helpful for domestic violence. I'm not anti-couples counseling. If you're in a relationship where there's, safety and trust, it can be really wonderful. But when we're talking about this imbalance of power and control, it actually can create unsafe situations for the survivors. In my experience, usually one of two things happens. Usually the survivor feels like they're going to go in, they're going to try their best, they're going to share, they're going to give it their all. And then what happens is the abusive person uses that against them. Why did you say that about me? How dare you bring that up? You're wrong, right? More gaslighting, more victim blaming, more abuse. Or on the other hand, I've seen survivors who say, I know I can't talk openly because my partner is going to take that out on me. And then what happens is they shut down and may hear from the counselor, you're not participating, you're not trying. And so then they're getting blamed for that. So you just can't have that safe, trusting counseling relationship when that power and control is so skewed. So we definitely recommend, if that is something like a judge or court is trying to ask for, to advocate actually for individual services for each person to get what they need before potentially coming back together. So children who witness domestic violence will grow up to repeat the pattern. Hear this one all the time. This one's a little bit sticky because there's truth in the reality that domestic violence is a learned behavior and that people may pick up those patterns, learn those patterns and try them out and test them out. There's some truth in that. But the reality is that it's a much more complex picture than that. What we know from a lot of research with children and with kids over time is that the presence of even one single person in their life who is safe and supportive and loving can really counter adverse effects from witnessing or experiencing violence in childhood. So there's an incredible opportunity there if we know children are in households where this is happening, to talk to the safe, loving parent, to talk to other people in that child's lives, and to really intervene and provide love and support and understanding around healthy relationships and what's okay and what's not okay. And I think that is particularly important. I like to talk about it because what I see is that survivors often start to blame themselves. They'll see their children acting out trauma responses, getting angry and not knowing how to deal with it or getting frustrated. And they often may say, oh, this is a sign they're going to become an abusive person, like their mom or their dad. And the reality is that trauma responses are very different from choosing abuse as an adult. And so there's a whole world of opportunity there with kids. Anything anybody wants to add on those? Okay, jump in if you want to. I just want to make sure I'm not going too fast. So the last one, also super, super important. This idea that domestic violence is more common amongst people in a certain economic class. I hear this more often than anything else. I was just doing a training with DHS staff this morning, not intentionally to throw them under the bus, but they often bring this up and say, isn't this something that happens more? And it's not their fault. This is a message that's been out there and is pervasive. And what we know is that there's a couple things happening. One is that domestic violence is really similar as far as rates across all socioeconomic classes, but folks who have less income tend to have relationships where the violence goes on for longer because there's less opportunity to get help, less opportunity for additional resources and supports and exits if they want to exit. We also know that people who are on the lower side of the socioeconomic spectrum don't have the same right to privacy that people with a lot of economic privilege have. They're often over-policed. They have more social workers usually involved in their lives. People may be living in shared housing units, you know, hearing and seeing things that you might not hear and see if you're living in a big house with a big yard with a big fence around it. So a lot of times we see it more, it's more visible in those populations, but it's not that it's happening more necessarily. And so just to keep that in mind too, that you may have folks who come to you from all spectrum of income levels and backgrounds and privilege who are experiencing this stuff, definitely. Okay. Next. Sorry, I'm hitting next and it's not going for me. Let me try it again. Okay. So the second slide of myths, the ones that I really want to touch on here are these two middle ones, really. The idea that some people, quote unquote, pick abusive partners. This is often victim blaming belief that is internalized. I hear this a lot from survivors themselves, right? Like, I feel like I keep picking bad people. And the reality is we know that when you experience domestic violence, at one point in your life, you often have impacts from that. That might be a vulnerability in your life. You might still be recovering economically. You might, you know, be a single parent trying to navigate that. There's all of these things that could come up. And we know that people who use violence look for vulnerabilities to leverage in other people. So they're looking for these things and trying to seek people out. I have never, ever worked with a survivor who knew somebody was going to be abusive to them and was just like, I'm in it. This is great. This is what I want. That's not how this usually works, right? It's a very subtle thing in the beginning in a relationship, and you may not even notice anything is happening until you're sort of in it and a little bit stuck and don't know what to do. And then lastly, the other one I want to talk about is the next one, that drugs or alcohol and mental health diagnoses do not cause domestic violence. This is also a very common myth. Gets very muddied in court cases a lot of times whenever one person is trying to say that it's the drugs or alcohol that cause their behavior, or it's a mental health diagnosis. We know that those things can escalate abuse. They can make it more intense, but they don't cause it out of nowhere. And we know that folks often use these sort of as excuses for behavior, as a way to justify the choices they're making around violence. And I could talk about that topic all day. So if folks have any questions about that and want to learn more about where that comes from or some of the data we have on that, any of this stuff, really feel free to follow up, of course, with us afterwards. Any questions, comments, additions before we move on? Okay.
Okay, so now kind of some things to talk about. We'll do some safety planning basics before we take a break here. So safety planning, it's a big concept, it's a big word. You've probably heard it before around like safety plan. If you Google domestic violence safety plan, it will come up with thousands of documents and forms and things like that that you can look at. But one thing to kind of keep in mind around safety planning is that safety planning is a process. It's not just like a written form that you fill out and hand a survivor and send them on their way. It can take a lot of different forms and levels of depth depending on what is going on in any particular one person's situation. You know, we can sometimes Oftentimes, I'm on a Friday call, at 4:30 p.m. and our safety planning is looking like, what are we going to do to get you safely through this weekend so that we can get you connected to the services that are going to open on Monday? So it can take a lot of different forms. When thinking about kind of safety planning with some of the clients and survivors you're working with, the focus is really on harm reduction. It may not stop the abusive partner from attempting harm or causing harm. That's not something that's entirely within our control. The focus is on reducing the abuse and the impact of the abuse on the survivor. So really thinking about the things around what can we control, what can we start to take some of that control back on in a way that's safe so that we can continue to get through this situation and out of it if necessary. And so with that, things change, circumstances evolve, the services that the participant or the survivor may be connected with are going to evolve. And so flexibility and adaptation are absolutely necessary. Revisiting, some of the plans and things regularly is a really important, just kind of best practice when thinking about safety planning. Something that worked last week may not work this week, and that's okay. It's just a matter of, continuing to check in on that progression. And so with that, following the survivor's directives about what works best for their situation is so important, and I think oftentimes gets overlooked. We love, and I, as an advocate, I love to say I'm an expert in domestic violence. And that's what I do. I've lived it. I do it as a job now, but I also recognize that each survivor is the expert in their own life. No other person on this planet knows your own life better than you because you've been there for every second of it. And so they're going to know what is going to work and what's not going to work. So oftentimes, safety planning is a process of pointing out some things to think about and have conversations about, and then they'll be able to make those decisions around what works and what doesn't. As I mentioned before, Google the millions of safety planning forms that are out there. I did actually send one over to Brett that has some kind of ideas to think about. But if you do have any sort of like written safety plan materials, or even things like incident logs, if that's something that a survivor is needing to keep for a legal case, making sure that those are stored in a safe area where they're not going to be accessed by others, whether that be the abusive partner or just someone else, for the sake of privacy and confidentiality, and also being aware of how things are stored, that they may be subpoenaed. And so with that, despite safety planning not being a written document that is a be-all fit-all for every person, there are some things around strategies that you can keep in mind when you are working with survivors. And remembering that these should always be connected directly to what the survivor or you identify as risk, and taking into account their personal and cultural preferences. Again, they're the expert in their life. We're the guide to kind of help them think about some of these things. And so with these not being a one-size-fits-all scenario, you can often introduce some of these ideas into the conversation about being like, hey, here are some things that have worked with other people that I've worked with. Here are some things we may want to think about for your situation. And safety planning touches back on the different types of abuse. Yes, there are absolutely things around kind of physical safety that we'll think about, safer rooms or spaces inside the homes. Oftentimes, one of the things that I ask survivors is if there are any weapons in the house, kitchen knives, guns, things like that. If you know that an incident is going to happen, where can you try to have that happen in the house? Can you get yourself out into the front hallway instead of the kitchen so that that person can't turn around and grab that knife? Can you get yourself into a room where you can exit the building if you need to? Things like that. In terms of kind of your work, things that may come up regularly, especially around parenting plan, so things with custody. As a couple of you have mentioned in the chat, things around children. Children are often kind of used by abusive partners as a tool to continue to manipulate, particularly after separation. If that's something that's going to keep you in contact with the survivor, then you need to think about ways that a survivor can handle those situations as safely as possible. So oftentimes when making a parenting plan with someone, I'll talk with them about where's a safe place that we can do this child exchange. That may be somewhere in public where you know that someone's going to be there. It may be at a police station. It may be at the Starbucks, down the street because the barista knows you and knows your kids. It's different for everyone. Similarly, around keeping a journal or log of incidents, if that's something that the survivor needs for their case, talking with them about how they can do that safely, where that's going to be stored. Will they keep it on their phone, keep it in the cloud? Is it going to be written down on paper? And then touching back on what Shannon mentioned earlier around critical items and documents. This is so important and oftentimes overlooked around, if things are starting to escalate and if someone is thinking about separating in particular, this tends to come up. What are all of the various, items and documents that we need? It's kind of going through, I would have to go and write it down for myself, all of my various things, my ID, birth certificate, social security cards, visas, anything like that an abuser may try to take in order to continue to control that person, making a plan of getting those items together, even if that means, having to figure out how to get a new copy of it and where to store those so that they're easy to grab and go if necessary. So there are other kind of things too around, safety, especially after someone has left, around varying travel routes. If you have a certain routine, changing it up to reduce kind of some of that stalking behavior in particular, accessing options like the address confidentiality program or the victim notification network, changing bank accounts, things like that. Maybe that means just changing the account. Maybe it means changing the bank. All of those things that are less likely to perpetuate that control. So other things that may come up commonly for you all in your work with survivors, one that comes up very, very often in my work, I'd say at least once a week, I'm having a conversation with someone around communication with their landlord. Oftentimes, again, that control can come out around someone's housing situation, abusers causing damages, things like that, staying over when they're not on the lease. And so connecting people with fair housing support and knowing about what their rights are as a survivor. Oftentimes, landlords may not be the most familiar about someone's rights, especially if they don't know it's a domestic violence situation. So giving that information or connecting them to someone who can in those cases, if someone mentions, I've been having these issues with my landlord, talk about it. Another piece that comes up frequently in legal cases is updating safe contact information, making it very, very clear to survivors. If you are doing something that is going through the courts, what is the other person going to see? And making sure that they know that before it gets filed. Oftentimes I've worked with survivors who didn't know that their new address was going to show up on the contact information section of that restraining order. And then it gets served and the abuser shows up. And they were like, I didn't know that they would now know where I live. So making that very, very clear with people and thinking about some of the alternatives that are available to use, things like email addresses, again, address confidentiality program, things like that. And following up on kind of the protective order piece in particular, since a lot of you mentioned that you work with survivors on their protective orders, is around obtaining and keeping a copy of the protective order. Things right now, especially with the remote world, are a little bit different in terms of people being able to access copies of their restraining order, but making a plan with people around where they may need copies of that, where they can get copies. For one thing, some people often aren't even told where they can access those copies and who they need to provide that to. So things like if they have, their children's school, if they have something around the other party not being able to go to the school, how do they want to notify the school about that? Do they want to give a copy to their employer in case the person shows up there? So thinking about those kind of steps when you're filling out the restraining order or protective order with someone are a really great thing to keep in mind. So last kind of piece on here, if y'all either want to unmute yourselves or pop it in the chat before we head into a break, what other kind of safety planning strategies or tools have you used or that you've heard of?
I'll pipe in. I've worked with some clients where we've had pretty specific or more location specific safety plans, such as to and from the courthouse, to and from the grocery store, to work, daycare, things like that.
Thank you, Brett. There's also a comment in the chat, Sarah, from Eileen. Keep protective order on the phone, provide a copy to a trusted neighbor, and get a security camera or system. You can have a safe person that you use a safe word or phrase with. Meeting at a public location like grocery store parking lot instead of trading children at a home of one of the parties.
Absolutely. Those are all great too. And one of the things too, you know, with safe people, I always kind of think of it back to like my hiking basics. If I'm going on a hike, I tell someone where I'm going, how long I expect to be gone, and when they can hear from me. So similar things like that. You know, if you have a set time that you have to go do a childcare exchange, make sure that safe person knows that and knows, you know, if I don't hear from you in 45 minutes, what do I do as your safe person? You know, do I come look for you? Do I call law enforcement? Things like that. So.
And lastly, there was one more addition in the chat that says get a Google Voice number. So for folks who don't know, it's a sort of number that can disguise your actual number. You can make calls or emails from a different number and folks won't be able to identify it necessarily as yours.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for those. And I think our next slide here is that we're going to head into just a short bio break here. You know, grab a snack, get something to drink, check your email. We all know the emails never stop. So Shannon, do you have a time frame you'd like us to convene?
I have 2:05, 2:06 now on my calendar. So why don't we just say 2:15? That's 9 minutes. Is that good for folks? I'm assuming you all are nodding. I can't see any of you, but let's just say, let's say 2:15. We'll see you back. Okay, I think we're going to get started again. I've got 2:15 over here. Hopefully everybody got to stand up, stretch, do what you needed to do. We're going to continue on and sort of shift more into what do we do? How do we talk to folks? What are some of the best practices for supporting survivors? What are maybe some pitfalls to avoid, and what are resources, and how do you connect with advocates? So we're going to try to cover some of that in these last 45 minutes. First, I want to say, as we talk about responding to survivors and providing support to them, I just want to be clear that there's no cookie cutter, one size fits all way to help a survivor of violence, right? Everybody's experience is unique, everybody's personalities are unique. It's not always going to be exactly the same. But what we do know is that based on a lot of feedback from survivors, a lot of conversations with advocates, we know some of the things that tend to work better than others. So we're going to try to share with you some of those best practices to keep in mind. And some of them are pretty obvious. Some of them may be less obvious. So feel free to jump in as well, again, with the chat, with things that you've done that work well that you might want to share with your colleagues here today, or other ideas that you have, because these are just sort of high level things. We know that there's millions of different things that you all do that is really helpful to people. And you may have also learned, you know, from those experiences when you stumbled a bit. Those have been some of my biggest learning opportunities, when I've maybe messed it up a little bit, and I've learned from that, right? So if you feel vulnerable and open enough to share that, please feel free to do that as well. So on this slide here, you'll see a few again, sort of best practices. First and foremost, and I cannot stress this enough, when someone is telling you about their experience of abuse, believe them, believe them, believe them. Most survivors, unfortunately, I think have had at least one experience where they've shared with somebody what's happened to them, and they've been met with skepticism or disbelief or judgment. And oftentimes that just reinforces messages from the abusive people that they've gotten, right? Which is, no one's going to believe you that this is happening. No one's going to be around to help you. So it's really important to trust what they're telling you and to listen well to their full story, right? Try to check any biases within yourself that you may have. Again, like questioning those gaslighting things. Try to be aware if your mind wants to do that, and really be present with them. Be mindful of their emotional safety. What I mean by that is really speaking to those trauma responses that happen in our brains and bodies, even when we're in a safe space at the moment, right? So I'm sure that folks can relate to having had a scary experience of some sort in your life and remembering that experience. And you might feel your body tense up again or your heart start to race. Just because a survivor is safe with you in your office or in a courtroom doesn't mean they feel safe in their body and in their mind. And so as you're working with folks, particularly if you're going through interviews where they're having to recount very violent things, unsafe things, painful things, it can be very helpful to, take pauses, take breaths, check in, allow people to stand up and move around, get physical energy out of their bodies if they need to. A lot of that really has to do, again, with that trauma inside. Honor their expertise. So Sarah talked about this. I don't need to say much more about it. Trust them, honor them. They know their lives best. And for what it's worth, research consistently shows, like, it's backed up by data, that survivors are the best indicators of what the abusive person will do next. They know that person as well. So if they're telling you, for instance, that filing for a restraining order is going to make it worse, we need to believe that. We need to trust that, and actually then look for other options. So sometimes restraining orders are great. Sometimes they're not. But that person's going to be able to really walk through that with you and tell you what they believe will happen, what the outcome is going to be. Supporting them and identifying small steps. Again, talking about trauma, if any of you have ever taken sort of a basic trauma in the brain training, if you haven't, let me know. We'd be happy to do that. But if you have, you've probably learned a little bit about how our brain responds when we're feeling unsafe. And one of the things that's really helpful to do is break things down into small steps to keep people grounded and engaged with what's present and what's in front of you, versus letting that brain sort of flip back into panic mode again. That's more of that emotional safety stuff, right? So helping people focus on the present and the now can be very, very helpful. It can be difficult for survivors to think really big, like long term, like 4 or 5 years from now sometimes, when they're still really present in the trauma. So sometimes we need to think smaller and then move it out as people start to heal and start to think differently. Avoid victim blaming and judgments. I don't think any of you would do this intentionally, right? I'm not trying to say that you would, go out and try to say something that's going to harm somebody or make them feel guilty or shameful for what's happened to them. But I think all of us, myself included, have had experiences where I've said something and then after thought, oh, that did not come out the way that I wanted it to. And survivors are so often blamed for the abuse that, of course, we want to help shift that to where it belongs, and that's to the person committing the abuse, right? One of the most common ways this comes up is that very common question of, why did you stay? Why have you stayed with somebody so long? That can be asked with really good intent, but can feel to the person hearing that question like a judgment, like they're judging me for staying with this person. So I would, just encourage you to be thoughtful about your language. And if you are asking somebody, if you want to ask somebody why they stayed, what is it you're really trying to get at? You know, are you trying to get at what have been the barriers you've had to being in a safe relationship? What have been challenging for you to exit, you know, from the situation you're in? Think about what you're really trying to get at versus sort of these broader judgmental questions that can come off that way. The next one on here sounds kind of obvious again in some ways, but avoid name calling the abusive person. This is important because you, particularly if you're providing pro bono services, you're there to advocate for your client, right? You're on their side, and we're very, very thankful that you're doing that. But sometimes it can be difficult to not get caught up in saying, oh yeah, that other person, your partner, is a, you know, fill in the blank, a jerk, a whatever. And the fact of the matter is the survivor of violence is often still going to have feelings of connection and love to that person, even if they're trying to separate, even if they're being harmed. And we don't want to trigger sort of triangulation, you know, defensiveness, separation. So keeping your conversations focused on the behavior and not the person, right? What that person did to you is absolutely unacceptable. Is very different from that person is unacceptable. That person is a bad person. So thinking about keeping it really focused on the behaviors. And then in the third column, as again, simple and as trite as it may sound, actually saying the words to survivors, this is not your fault. You did not deserve this abuse. Nothing you did caused this or made you deserving of this, can be incredibly important for people to hear. So please don't ever shy away from just verbalizing that. I pointed out because a lot of times what I have learned is that people think they're conveying that with body language and with expression, but it's powerful to hear those actual words. So please, you know, think about how you may convey that in your work with survivors. And also the second one, saying things like, I'm worried about your safety, right? Can we talk about safety planning? I have concerns for you and your kids tonight, or things like that, is a way to just say, let's do this together. Let's talk about this together. I'm not judging your actions. I just want to help you be safer today. So thinking about how you may approach those conversations. And then lastly on here, ask only questions that are relevant to current needs. We're very, very curious beings as humans. And it can be easy to just get in a conversation and just start asking questions because you're curious about the answer. But the reality is that every time we ask a survivor to talk about their trauma, they're having to relive that trauma. And you may not be able, because of your role, to be the one that helps them package all that up and heal it and put it away, right? So we have to be careful of what we open and what we dig out. So ask the things and have the conversations that are, of course, relevant to the work you're providing, the services you're providing, but just be cautious about, you know, do you really need the details of, you know, X, Y, and Z incident right now? And if you do need those details, are you ready and prepared to have other resources present or to provide the support that person's going to need after digging into all of that emotional trauma with you? And Sarah's going to talk about some of those resources in a minute, so we're not going to leave you hanging on that. Let me go on to this next slide. With all of that in mind too, I've been referencing trauma a lot. And I know this is not a trauma overview training. So I am making some assumptions about what people may know or what you may have heard about trauma. I have this slide in here because we see so often that trauma responses are misread or misinterpreted as faults in human beings, right? We may assign judgment or blame. And when you're working with survivors of domestic violence who've been through a lot of trauma, these items, A through F here on the trauma response side, are extraordinarily common to see among survivors. As they're talking with you, they might be hypervigilant, they might be jumpy, they might be on edge, right? Numbing, shutting out painful memories. They might be telling you about an incident that happened with their partner that's violent and scary and horrifying, and talking about it like it was, a day at the park, because our body is protecting us from that trauma, and they may numb it out and separate and disassociate a little bit from that experience. So these different things on the left are some of the more common ones that I've seen over the years that get misinterpreted. So people may see that hypervigilance as being paranoid or jumpy, or is it, are they so fidgety because they're on something? I know I'm a fidgety person. When I am anxious or nervous, I fidget like crazy. And I know that that may be misread by people who don't know me or have the context for me about what that could be. So just being thoughtful and cautious, and again, avoiding that sort of instinct to maybe judge or assign meaning to behaviors when you don't necessarily know all the information yet, I think is very important. The one under E, difficulty with memory, is really, really important, and difficulty concentrating for survivors. This is a part of the brain that specifically gets impacted by a lot of trauma. And what you'll find when you're trying to talk with survivors about timelines and about incidents, maybe to prepare for a hearing or a court case, is that they may jump all around. They may remember one thing one day and something else the next day. And this is often a direct impact of that trauma. So, not assuming lying, helping explain that to the court if the judge doesn't have that information, right? What is going on? Why did the survivor say something on Tuesday and then remembered something else on Friday? That might actually be from the trauma and the impacts of memory, and not because they're now making something up or now trying to add in this other information, right? So these are really important, I think, to understand during those situations and during those cases. Sarah, do you have anything to add to any of that? Okay, thank you. And then this here, this is just kind of an FYI, because talking about our own wellness and our own trauma, you're gonna be impacted by working with people. It's not an if or a when, you will, because that is just the way that humans are built. That when you're exposed to other people's trauma, it impacts you. And it may not at first, but it will over time, right? And that's natural and it's normal, but if we're not recognizing it and on top of it, it can take an incredible toll. I mentioned at the beginning, I've been doing domestic violence work in some form for about 17 years. I definitely had periods of that 17 years where I have not managed my wellness and I have become burnt out, just experienced so much pain from other people suffering that I haven't known how to deal with it. And so we put this in here as a recognition of that. We don't want it to go unmentioned, because it's not only important to the way that you serve folks and their experiences, but it's just important to your own sustainability in your jobs and your roles. And if you want more information, we can provide it. We do other trainings on this stuff. That's not what the intention of today was necessarily, but we wanted to acknowledge its reality as we talk about all of this difficult stuff today. And one of the things that can help you with all of that is the wonderful world of advocates. And I'm going to let Sarah start to tell you about that.
So this is the great point where I get to talk about myself, because I am still working as a current advocate. No, this is, more general around advocates as a whole. Well, I do get to be a part of that group. So, kind of one of those things, like we've talked about a lot of stuff around domestic violence, trauma response, safety planning, all of those things. You are in no way expected to be an expert on all things domestic violence when you exit out of the virtual Zoom room today, because there are people like me who do this for a living. It's really great to have that basic understanding, so that when you're in the moment with someone, you're able to support them, in the way that they need. But there's also a lot of opportunities to connect to advocates. There are quite a few advantages of being an advocate and connecting to advocates. We go through quite a bit of specialized training and have expertise in the really complex dynamics of power and control, the stuff around safety planning, policies, resources, tools, the various systems that survivors are going to interact with. One of the things that we see regularly is that survivors have to make a lot of really big life changes, when they're dealing with a domestic violence situation. And that often means that they're having to interact with a lot of different people from a lot of different systems who have a lot of different things going on. And that can be really, really overwhelming and scary. And it can be a big barrier. When you are told here are the 8 different, forms that you have to fill out in order to access this benefit. And then there's 10 more for this. And there's also this system over here that you might want to get connected to. That's a lot to try to take in when you're in that trauma brain. And so advocates are there to support survivors in leading their own way through those services and supports of their own choosing. Really what happens for me when I sit down with a survivor is I help them look at their situation holistically and connect them to a variety of resources. Some of those resources may be things that I can provide directly. I do restraining orders every day. We can do safety planning. We can do a lot of other things. Or also then giving them the information and making those warm handoffs to the other resources so that they're not alone in this. Oftentimes, isolation is one of the things that we see. And so having a collaborative system of support rather than just getting thrown into it by yourself is one of the things we work for as advocates. Our services are typically rooted in trauma-informed and anti-oppressive frameworks. We have a lot of training around culturally responsive services and around making some of the connections between individual incidents of domestic violence and some of the greater kind of social and institutional barriers that survivors may face, and how to respond to people experiencing trauma. One of the things that's kind of unique for qualified domestic violence advocates is that in general, we typically are not mandatory reporters and instead have advocate privilege, which I'm sure quite a few of you know about. But essentially one of the really great things with that is that a survivor can talk to someone who is confidential, where the survivor is the one who gets to control the conversation, both in the room and in terms of what leaves that room. It's up to the survivor. And so it's kind of an opportunity for them to take back some of the power and control that has been systematically taken away from them by an abuser. So with that, there are a lot of resources. There are many, many resources, both locally and nationally. So starting off with kind of some of the local resources, some of these are throughout Oregon, and some of these are more specific to the Tri-County area. So first off, especially in the remote world, one thing to keep in mind, with the pandemic, a lot of things have changed in terms of how services are being provided right now. And a lot of these organizations have really worked hard to transition to be able to provide services, via phone, online. We have all sorts of things that are being done electronically now as well. So a really great place to start for yourselves or for survivors if they're looking for resources is by calling either Call to Safety or La Línea Única. Those are both 24/7 crisis lines. They're all staffed by domestic and sexual violence advocates. La Línea Única is from El Programa Hispano, so all of their staff are bilingual in Spanish. And so oftentimes, Call to Safety and La Línea are able to make that initial connection to resources, maybe expand on, some of the safety planning that you've done, really go into some of those details that you don't necessarily need to know about. There's also for kind of Multnomah County and the Tri-County area, the Family Violence Coordinating Council has a resource list that lays out a lot of the programs that are out there, including the culturally specific services. There's a wide continuum of domestic and sexual violence providers in the area that are able to help survivors. So it's online on the website, it's easy to access. And I've also sent this over along with a list about some of the Multnomah County programs, how they're operating right now. I sent those over to Brett so he can distribute to those who are interested in them. So as you can see, there's a lot of resources listed on here, and they do update it around what's happening right now with COVID-19 since things are changing regularly. So So one that you saw listed on there is the Gateway Center. So the Gateway Center has transitioned to doing all of their services over the phone. They don't provide case management, but they are able to make referrals to longer term supports in addition to supporting with restraining orders, safety planning, all sorts of things. If you have any questions about Gateway, feel free to let me know. I've been there for quite a while now. In Clackamas County, there's a Safe Place Family Justice Center and Clackamas Women's Services, who are both doing kind of partial phone services and then partial in-person services for people who are safer going in person. They've been able to accommodate some of that. And in Washington County, there's the Family Justice Center and the Domestic Violence Resource Center, which same thing, some things are happening in person and others are over the phone. But in terms of Oregon in general, the first place that I point to people if they're looking for a program that's more local to their area is going on to the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence website. So on here, this is the Find Help tab. So there's a couple of different ways that you can search on here. OCADSVA has over 50 member programs throughout the state of Oregon in various counties and in tribal nations. And so, you can search by location, language, service type to be able to help survivors find something that is going to be most supportive to their situation. So, say that you're in, I don't know, Malheur County, and you're wanting to look for something there, or Deschutes, you can look up on here. And OCADSVA also updates this regularly with how services are being offered with COVID-19. All of the updates go on there regularly. So that's a really great place to start in terms of kind of local resources. And then expanding outwards, kind of nationally, for resources that may be helpful both for survivors and for yourselves. One that I'd really like to point out is the National Domestic Violence Hotline. One of the things that is a little bit unique about the hotline, especially looping back to the conversation we had around technological safety, a few people had pointed out taking away access to a phone is a very common form of technological abuse. And also right now, with people primarily being in the home, it may not be safe to try to make a phone call if you know that your abusive partner is in the other room and might hear you. So for people who have access to computer or phone, the hotline, the national hotline has a 24/7 online chat function. And they also have kind of some safety features around that, where they would be able to connect to resources and advocacy via chat instead. The National Network to End Domestic Violence, or NNEDV, has a plethora of resources. It is a really, really great place to get lost for hours in looking at resources. So be aware if you dive into that, there's a lot on there. What I'd like to highlight for them is that they have their safety net program, has so many handouts and toolkits and just information about safety for survivors. And they do a lot around the technology safety, around what is safe for survivors to use. And they've actually created a whole new toolkit specifically for COVID-19 around platforms that are safe to use when interacting with survivors. So things that have encryption or that have some extra kind of safety features on it, so that that the survivor is being able to access things in a way that is safe, that maybe their abuser isn't as easily able to access. And then the last kind of national one that I'd like to highlight is the National Center for Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health, because they have tip sheets. I personally love tip sheets. And Trauma Informed Oregon also has some that are more specific, but they give some really good basic information about trauma. I know we kind of did a 30,000-foot overview of that today. And so if you'd like to kind of get some more information, both that you could easily, send to a client or for yourselves, then they have a whole lot of things on there, both for people experiencing trauma directly and also that vicarious trauma and kind of self-care burnout prevention piece that comes up for us as we work with survivors. And also just a note on all of these links and whatnot, we've sent a copy of this PowerPoint over. Brett will be able to distribute that. So y'all will be able to access all of the things. You don't have to scribbly write it down right now in the training or anything like that. And then the kind of final thing on here as a resource, Shannon and we are here. So we're always here to help with any questions you may have around some of the things we've talked about today, about how to get survivors connected to resources. You know, we like to talk about our experience and knowledge. I'll speak for myself. Knowing Shannon has some of the most knowledge in domestic violence of anyone I've met. So if anyone has any questions right now, feel free to unmute yourselves or pop it in the chat. And in the future as well, our emails are on the PowerPoint, so you're always welcome to reach out to us if you have any other follow-up questions later on.
So Sarah, I don't know if you can see the chat right now, but do you have specific recommendations for trauma-informed interviewing techniques?
I would say off the top of my head, I really actually enjoy the content that Trauma Informed Oregon puts out. They do have a couple of handouts on there and kind of some short toolkits around trauma-informed interviewing techniques. Motivational interviewing is a really great specific technique that you can get a lot of in-depth training on to be able to use it. But a lot of it comes back to, in my opinion, just around the active listening and the survivor voice around what do you, when I go in to meet with a client, either, back in the day in person or now over the phone, I ask people if they can tell me a little bit about their situation or what are they looking to access today? What's kind of going on for them, and letting them really lead the conversation, and then making those little nudges if I need to get specific information, like if we're filling out a restraining order or things like that, where we have to ask specific questions, we can. But a lot of it comes back to guiding the conversation in a way that lets them take lead. And Shannon, I'm sure you also have things you use.
I think just the couple of things that are really coming to mind right now that are like sort of quick tips that I can offer is one is just to be as clear as possible. And that is, again, because of the way that trauma sort of impacts our brain and the way that we're receiving information sometimes. And so clarity is incredibly important. And that can look like everything from like repeating things back, those sort of like understanding, does this sound right? Am I hearing this right? But also one of the things that happens a lot is people with a lot of trauma, when they're talking about difficult experiences, can flood with memories and emotions and stories. And when I talk to professionals, that gets really tricky because y'all are busy. And so sometimes you have like 30 minutes, 45 minutes. And what I would say is be really clear with the survivor at the beginning. We have 30 minutes today. Here's our goal of what we said we were going to get through. If we get off track, is it okay if I try to steer us back? That way, if you're having to rein someone in, it's an agreed upon framework. It doesn't feel like you're shutting them down. It doesn't feel like you're cutting them off. I have found that to be really, really helpful when digging into difficult things. And then also offer things in multiple formats, verbal, written, imagery, whatever works for each individual's sort of mind can be very helpful. So that flexibility in how you're offering information can be really, really helpful. Sorry, I'm trying to read the chat as well.
One last one that I'll add on there. There's a technique called ask, offer, ask that I will fall back to ask, offer, ask all the time, where essentially you ask someone if they want. So for example, I'll ask someone if they want more information about X, Y, and Z. They say yes. I offer that information to them. And then I ask, do you have any questions about that? Or what do you think? So it gives an opportunity for them to give consent before I just start throwing a bunch of information at them. And then also a chance to reflect back on it.
Thanks, Sarah. So a couple of things here in the chat as well. Sarah, I'm going to throw this to you. Do you have specific recommendations for minors, and does the reporting exception apply for advocates when consulting with minors?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in terms of kind of the reporting exception, no, I'm a I'm a confidential advocate if I'm working with someone above or below the age of 18 without, essentially the long and short of it, without their consent or without a specific subpoena. I don't talk about that, what we talk about. So I don't make reports. I'm not a mandatory reporter to CPS. I will say in terms of working with minors, that does come up for me, oftentimes around the restraining orders, around, thinking about things for minors accessing restraining orders. And that's oftentimes where then, we'll kind of do some partnership, and oftentimes with legal aid, in terms of referrals around the law side of things. But also around safety planning, around what that looks like for their family. So, are the parents the ones who are contributing to, abusive situations? Are the parents safe and supportive? How can we play into that? And also often giving some information about some of the youth-specific resources. Shannon put in the chat, Raphael House has a teen-specific program, a couple of others within kind of the youth continuum. Oftentimes, again, it comes back to creating a network for people, that they have multiple, resources that they can connect with or turn to.
I also see in the chat, is there a resource for translation services for domestic violence survivors? I've run into some problems with quote unquote insensitive interpreters. I think Sarah and I both understand what you mean by that. Peter, thank you for asking that question. Sarah, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, so IRCO has a language bank that oftentimes I will try as my funding sources allow when they have contracts to use IRCO, because they also have a domestic violence program, and their domestic violence program has been really great about trying to make sure that some of the basics around trauma-informed communication and care also go out to those who are working on interpreter contracts. But I also, personally, I have been known, I will, if I'm going to be using an interpretation service, especially over the phone, I will talk to the person for a couple of minutes before, if I'm setting up a conference call, and kind of make sure that we have some basic communication standards between us around, expectations and things. And also with, if survivor's not comfortable with what's happening, or if things are escalating in a way, we can always find other options. That's something that we always promote, is that it's up to the person and their choice around how people talk to them. So.
Absolutely. And I would just add to that, if you are in a situation where you feel like something isn't going well with the interpreter, something's off, or maybe they're not interpreting everything the way that you want it to be interpreted, or stuff's coming up, feel free to reach out to one of those programs on the resource list, or even our office. We may not be able to provide that interpretation, I'm not saying that, but we may be able to say, oh, we've worked with these folks who do this type of interpretation before. We might be able to help get you somewhere that's a little bit more vetted. Not always, but we definitely try our best, because our programs deal with this stuff all the time. And so we may be able to help with that. We're always happy to field those questions and try.
Mm-hmm. And that is to many of the culturally specific domestic violence agencies. A lot of the staff are bilingual or trilingual or multilingual in other ways. So there's a good chance, if you refer someone over, that they may be able to get them connected to someone who is a qualified advocate who also speaks the same language.
Absolutely. Any other final questions before we wrap up? I know this is a lot of information crammed into not a lot amount of time. And so I really just want to thank everybody. And I genuinely mean this, that I told Brett this when I met him, legal aid attorneys and pro bono attorneys are some of my favorite people in the world, because speaking as somebody who's worked with survivors for a long time and experienced violence in my own life as a child, I know that the services that you all are providing can really make such a difference for safety and stability for people who don't have access to the economic resources to hire, somebody on their own. And so I just really want to thank you for what you're doing and the work you're doing. And definitely you're welcome to reach out to Sarah or I, and we're always happy to connect you with our colleagues. If you have questions about something that we may not be the right person to ask, we can help direct you or steer you where you need to go. So hopefully this is just the start of a partnership in working with survivors as you go down this path. So thank you from me. Sarah, I don't know if you have any closing words.
Oh, absolutely. Some of you have probably actually seen me in my other capacities. And I genuinely cannot say enough. The reaction that I get when I am working with a survivor and I say that I can connect them to a legal aid consultation, to a consultation with an attorney who can answer those questions. Because for those of us who did not go to law school, it can be really, really overwhelming. There is like a physical, tangible sigh of relief that survivors experience when they hear there is someone who is willing to help me with these really complicated and kind of scary systems. I cannot put into words the value that the work that you do has for survivors. It makes such a huge difference in safety and stability and feeling like someone cares, especially coming from a larger system in the legal system. It's really life-changing. So thank you all for being willing to take 2 hours out of your day on a busy day to kind of learn more about what we do and how we can work together.
And thanks.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Shannon and Sarah, for giving us your time this afternoon and sharing your expertise. I do have a few closing announcements to make. Just again, a recording of this presentation and the materials that Shannon and Sarah mentioned will be made available on OregonAdvocates.org. I'm hoping that will be up there by the end of the week. But of course, feel free to send me an email and I'll send you those beforehand if you'd like as well. Also, CLE credits are pending, and in the next couple weeks, well, hopefully sooner than that, this program should show up on the Oregon State Bar MCLE program database. Just as a reminder, in order to receive credit for this presentation, you must add the seminar to your MCLE compliance report. I'm also happy to send out the event ID number once that becomes available from the bar. Again, big thank you to Shannon and Sarah, and thank you everyone for joining us today.